Hello my dears, I hope that you're doing well. Welcome to another video. Today's is a bit inspired by two other creators, so I want to shout them out before we jump into anything because that feels important. Also, for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I'm wearing a t-shirt that you can just see that it's dark gray, but it's a JSTOR t-shirt. I bought a JSTOR t-shirt. It's one of my favorite possessions and I can't stop wearing it. And then I have an open 3/4 sleeve off-white button-up on top. That took way more brain cells than it should have taken. Anyway, so 4 years ago, a YouTuber named Caleb Joseph released a video called I Watched Every The Fault in Our Stars ripoff, where he talked about his opinions on The Fault in Our Stars and 5 other films in that genre, and gave his opinions on all of them. And then last June, a YouTuber named Mothcub released a video called Love Actually in the Hell Genre It Spawned, where she breaks down, I think it was over 10 different Love Actually inspired films and why the genre is terrible. And both of those videos made me wonder, has anybody talked about like the issues with the sick lit genre that seem to have spawned from the success of The Fault in Our Stars in an academic sense? And so naturally I googled it, and the first thing that came up was my own review of this book from 2 years ago, which was woefully unhelpful, and also like a handful of blog posts and maybe 2 or 3 academic articles, but that was kind of it. So now we're here. The plan is to do this sort of like I did my Lunar Chronicles breakdown video, where I give a summary of each book or film and then talk about the disability narratives within it. We're doing these in chronological order of IP release. I'm just covering the 6 films reviewed by Caleb Joseph, as well as another book that I was recommended, so this is not going to be an exhaustive analysis of the entire genre, but it should hit the major ones that plagued at least my middle and high school experience. Hopefully, I mean not hopefully yours, but likely yours as well. All of which to say, big spoiler warnings for all of the above, obviously, but also if you don't know what happens in The Fault in Our Stars yet, I'm incredibly impressed. If you have any other micro-genres or specific book series you want me to make this style deep dive on, let me know in the comments. This kind of video is pretty time intensive, but also not super research intensive, which is a really great mental break for me. Hunger Games is definitely up next on this list, but I'm always happy to take other ideas, so please let me know what you're interested in learning about. Also, quick mandatory, hey, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you want to join my Patreon, that exists, because apparently saying those things is good for the channel. Awesome, amazing. So, The Fault in Our Stars was published on the 10th of January 2012, written in honor of and dedicated to John Green's friend Esther Earle, who died of thyroid cancer in 2010 at the age of 16. It has sold over 23 million copies, which makes it one of the best-selling books of all time, which I did not know. The film rights of the book were almost immediately bought, and then it became a film in June of 2014. And what I think is important to note is that this book did not create the genre of teen sick lit by any means. To first define that term, the phrase teen sick lit seems to have been coined by scholar Julie Passanante-Ellman in 2012, which she describes as a genre of adolescent fiction that fused illness and romance narrative to reinforce the interdependent norms of able-bodiedness, heteronormativity, emotional management, and maturity among American youth. Stories about illness and such have been around just about forever, but certain trends in these stories that we see in The Fault in Our Stars have popped up more in recent history. The teen sick lit genre emerged in the 1980s, sort of combining young adult novels, which started to become a genre around the late 60s and 70s, and autopathographies, which are memoir stories about illness and disability that began to appear around the 1950s. Cancer-specific autopathographies became more of a trend in the 90s, which likely led to that specific concept becoming more common in these stories in later variations starting around the same era, but again, the general concept has been around for some time. I think there is a world where I could have been way more thorough with this video and read a bunch of historical sick lit stories from the 80s and 90s as well to trace the entire legacy of this idea throughout history, but by the time I realized that was a potential option, I never want to look at a YA romance novel ever again, and also this is supposed to be less research heavy brain break project, so self-preservation is a great choice that I made. It doesn't seem like John Green has ever spoken about being inspired by any earlier sick lit books, nor has the author of Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, both of which were published sort of around the same time, so are like the 2 main ones that inspired the rest of everything else we're going to talk about today. So I didn't have any specific examples that I knew I should look at anyway to be super thorough, but it seems to me like this is one of those situations where the concepts of that genre had already seeped so much into other media that there was no specific, oh, this thing inspired me to do this, but rather an ingrained unconscious expectation for what books in the genre should look like at this point, if that makes any sense. So they were inspired by them, but probably never sat down and actually read one of them. Hallmarks of the genre are a sick heterosexual female protagonist who is centered technically, but usually it's narrated in the 3rd person, who worries about her attractiveness because her illness makes her so ugly, and then falls for a guy, usually only meeting other sick people, but the guy is always less sick or no longer sick, and then she contemplates the meaning of life while going through treatment and her tragic star-crossed lovers romance, and then she dies at the end of the book. And there's been discussion about the merits or lack thereof of this genre for a very long time. A lot of it feels very pearl clutchy and, oh, won't you think of the children, they shouldn't be reading dark and heavy things. But there is also some genuine critique to be had about the romanticization of death and dying young in a particular age group that is very prone to large emotions and reckless behaviors, which are not a fantastic mix. And it can also obviously create and perpetuate stereotype. We're going to talk about a lot of the negative disability stereotype stuff that can be internalized from these narratives that causes real harm later in this video. But at the same time, they also start hard conversations. They make some people feel less alone. I mean, like, when else do disabled teenage girls get to appear in literature, much less get the guy? And I feel like this is also a specific genre that tends to try to acknowledge the age-appropriate intelligence of its readers, or at least makes them feel smart, which I feel like is also part of the appeal. Because the YA age group is right around when you like want to start reading about darker things and have a lot of questions about romance and death and legacy and the adult world, but it feels like a lot of what you're expected to read sort of talks down to you or feels oversimplified, and then the like more heavy adult stuff feels a little bit too confusing and overwhelming. And I feel like John Green in particular, say what you want about the pretentiousness of how his characters speak, really did master that in between in a way that, yeah, we cringe at as adults, but when we were in that age group, it felt smart and representative of at least a portion of us, which is part of why it caught on so strongly. And like, it's been interesting in doing this because I've been trying to remember back when I voluntarily read this genre, which was, interestingly enough, before I became meaningfully sick enough to even like process that I was a sick person. So I consumed this media thinking I was a non-disabled person, and it's been really interesting to go back and see how this shaped how I viewed myself later in life, but we'll get to that. More generally, I think there's a tendency to look back on what we liked when we were young and just say it's cringe and say it's garbage or whatever, or act like we never actually liked it because that's embarrassing, but I don't think that's particularly fair. I mean, John Green is not a consistently best-selling author by chance. His stuff has some serious merit, even if it reads a little bit juvenile to an adult, but like, is that not the point? Like, isn't it good that we're outgrowing stuff that is meant for tweens and teens? But anyway, I digress. The point that I'm making here is that The Fault in Our Stars did not create the genre of teen sick lit, but it did launch it to the absolute stratosphere in popularity, and thus every single thing in the genre that came out after it was either directly or indirectly a derivative of it or otherwise cast in its shadow. And so I'm going to have a lot of critiques specifically aimed at this book and this film here, even though a lot of it actually is from the genre that was already in the social consciousness by this time, because of how those things became through lines in what follows and the harm that those narratives can potentially cause, or were fine in one story. Like, some things were totally fine in The Fault in Our Stars, but then became utilized in subsequent stories in a harmful way, or could be expanded out to be more harmful. To more critically understand this trend that plagued my middle and high school experience, because I think that that's interesting and fun, and why not look back on really the worst time in anybody's life. So let's begin with the general plot summary. It's narrated by a 16-year-old girl named Hazel Grace Lancaster who has thyroid cancer that has spread to her lungs and has already nearly killed her, but she is on this clinical trial medication that has miraculously stopped the tumor growth. She will still die soon, but nobody knows how long this medication is going to work, but it has given her a little bit more time at least. And her mother is convinced that she's depressed and forces her to go to a cancer support group where she meets this guy named Augustus Waters, who is currently in remission from osteosarcoma and has a prosthetic leg. Augustus is there to support his friend Isaac, who has eye cancer and will soon have an operation that will make him blind. And the two of them immediately hit it off, even though Hazel does not want to date anybody. She feels like she's a grenade who is going to hurt everybody around her when she dies, so it's better to keep her circle as small as possible to minimize the damage. So she's like, I'm not gonna actually get into this guy, but they do hit it off pretty quickly, and she tells him to read An Imperial Affliction, which is her favorite book of all time, which then becomes the thing that they majorly connect over, because after reading it, he also wants answers as to what happens after this novel ends. Hazel has tried writing the author to get answers. He is a recluse living in Amsterdam, but he's never responded to her. Gus will not give up so easily, and he manages to track down the author's assistant and manages to then be connected to the author through that assistant, and the author says he can only answer their questions in person. So Augustus uses his Make-A-Wish style wish to get them a trip to Amsterdam to go meet him to find all of the answers, but Hazel gets really sick and nearly dies, so this trip ends up getting delayed and potentially canceled, but eventually they're able to go, they have a magical and romantic time, but then when they meet the author, he turns out to be an incredibly rude alcoholic, and his assistant is so horrified by his behavior that she quits on the spot and brings them to see the Anne Frank house, where Hazel forces herself to climb all of the stairs, even though that is incredibly difficult for her because her lungs don't work, and then at the top of the stairs, she and Augustus have their first kiss. And there's some narrative Anne died young and so will we overlapping stuff here. We'll talk about this later. That night, they lose their virginities and they say that they love each other, and then the next day he tells her that his cancer is back and it's not going to get better, and upon returning to the US he deteriorates pretty quickly. He has a pre-funeral with Isaac and Hazel because he wants to hear their eulogies, and then he dies, and then the author appears at the funeral to apologize to Hazel. She declines his apology because he sucks, telling him to go away, but then learns that Gus had written something for her and mailed it to him, and so she tracks it down through the assistant and has a final moment of being grateful to have had a chance to love a grenade. Now, I'm gonna be really real with you. I still really like the book and the movie. As more of a time capsule than anything, the casting doesn't age fantastically, which makes it a bit hard to enjoy, not just for inauthentic casting reasons, if you catch my drift. But if you ignore that, the soundtrack is really great. The quirky design choices are really cool, even if both feel incredibly cliche today because they've been done to death after this. But at the time, they were really engaging and interesting and new. I also think the medium of film gives them space to do montages, so we actually see their relationship develop in a way that we don't get in the book, so it feels more real and solid, which builds up more strongly to the end of the book. The visualization of the Anne Frank house scene does in fact make it a lot worse, but it's easier to understand what the artistic vision behind it was, kind of, like overlapping the knowledge that Anne also died young and using her words around how young people shouldn't be forced to deal with such large and scary grown-up issues as young people. It's interesting. I like cognitively understand what the through line idea was through like a very early 2010s all experiences of oppression are sort of interchangeable sort of lens. Obviously those are very different experiences and comparing them feels uncomfortable and strange, and also that historical leeway that I'm giving to the narrative overlap does not defend the kiss that happens in said house. Overall, not a win of a scene. There's also some other Hollywoodization that smooths over and shines up some things in this film that I liked being more pointed or uncomfortable or edgy in the book. A lot of the dark humor about disability that I thought made the book more successful was gone, which was frustrating, but it is what it is. I honestly expected it to be a lot worse when it was Hollywoodized, so whatever, I'm gonna consider it a win. There's also just something about a blockbuster summer romance centering two visibly disabled teenagers, though sometimes Augustus seems to forget he has a prosthetic leg and needs to walk differently. It really varies scene to scene, but that's still absolutely revolutionary. No matter how flawed, and it's flawed, there is something about that in and of itself I think we kind of take for granted now when we critique this story. Particularly, like, the visual of the sex scene between the two of them still means a lot to me. That was a really cool thing to get to see. Again, my critiques are going to be a lot, but this story does actually hold up a great deal more today than I expected it to, based on how people talk about it colloquially. Like, yes, I rolled my eyes a lot, but I did expect it to be worse and did still kind of enjoy it, but maybe that's a little bit of nostalgia talking. Now, the first thing to address is the accuracy aspects of it. In the author's note, Green says, "This is not so much an author's note as an author's reminder of what was printed in small type a few pages ago. This book is a work of fiction. I made it up. Neither novels nor their readers benefit from attempts to divine whether any facts hide inside a story. Such efforts attack the very idea that made-up stories can matter, which is sort of the foundational assumption of our species. I appreciate your cooperation in this matter." And I do hear what he's saying here, but this is a bit of a catch-22 that we talked about in my video last month on Curious Incident, which I'll link above, where, like, Mark Haddon wanted to create a story that happened to center an autistic character without creating disability representation, which I would argue is both not possible and also a bit of an irresponsible look at the nature of and power of storytelling. When there is so little characterization of something in media, whatever characterization is created risks becoming one of or the dominant understanding of that thing, and thus there is a responsibility inherently to handle that properly. Is there some argument to be had that some people think cancer isn't really in the disability category, so who would think of narratively representing cancer as carrying that level of storytelling responsibility? Absolutely, I can cut some slack on this, especially since 2012, and obviously he wrote this before it was published, so maybe like 2010, was a very different time regarding representation discussions in media, particularly around chronic illness, which along with neurodivergence has entered the conversation more recently than other disability has. But I think we can simultaneously hold the grace of historical context with the modern day issues of a thing and shouldn't just go, oh, it's from a different time, and accept that completely uncritically. I'm completely fine with the occasional narrative shift of how something works for the purposes of storytelling, like how he made up this clinical trial miracle medication that prolongs Hazel's life. That doesn't really bother me too much, but there are other places where many scholars with lived experience have pointed out inconsistencies where it was an easy fix, or just completely takes somebody who knows things about cancer out of the narrative altogether, some of which we will bring up as we go through my analysis here. And I know that John Green did do his research on cancer for this book and then decided to ignore some things for plot purposes. There's a section after the audiobook where he explicitly talks about that, and I do agree that there is great merit in fiction and in suspension of disbelief. But also half of the merit of fiction is how it helps us to understand the non-fiction world around us, and it feels, I don't want to say irresponsible because it's a bit of a loaded word, but I guess unwise to act as if it is an issue to critique inaccuracies in a story about an important minority experience. And perhaps a bit hands-off to functionally say like, oh, I completely made up the story that feels real and takes place in the real world, so anything you internalize as real and causes harm because of that is an issue on the part of the reader. And I don't know if that's like precisely what he means, and if it is, that is again an incredibly early 2000s, early 2010s take to have that is likely changed over time. The Green brothers have very much inspired a lot of my educational content, so I know how much they're the kind of people who regularly change their opinions on things as they learn more, especially with including minority groups and minority stories. So, you know, that very well probably has changed over time, but I still think that these things are important to point out regardless. It would appear he has not attempted to create an accurate cancer narrative, but rather a coming-of-age young adult novel that uses cancer to create drama and the high stakes of near-death experience. Again, I don't think medical accuracy needs to be 100% in media. That's not always possible, but it should be at least around 90% or higher. And to be clear, that remaining 10% that isn't accurate should be there for justifiable narrative reasons, not something useless, stereotypical, and or to give an overly romanticized moment. I'm very picky with what I'm willing to justify, but I am willing to justify some things. I know that medical accuracy doesn't seem like a huge deal, especially if it's not perpetuating overtly harmful stereotypes, but like if you read something that's supposed to represent your experience and then it doesn't at all represent anybody's experience of said thing, it makes you feel completely alienated from it, and also like it doesn't represent you, especially if that thing is then glorified or simplified in the narrative with the changes that were made. And then everybody else assumes that it does accurately represent that experience, and they start to talk to you as if they understand said experience that you've had when they very much don't, which further alienates you from your own experience and also puts you in a constant position of needing to educate people, which is fundamentally exhausting. I also just find that medically accurate stories are usually stronger stories, but that's a conversation for another day. But the second part of that earlier quote is actually more what I wanted to point out, because disability can impact plot and day-to-day living. Absolutely. But it shouldn't be the sole driver of every single aspect of a piece. Or if it is, that needs to be very carefully done, and I've only seen that work on the very occasional own voices piece, but even that is rare. Using disability as the primary conflict of a story really easily sets up a cure or kill ending, where the conflict must be resolved, which can only happen by fixing it via, you know, it getting actually fixed, or by the character dying, which is pretty much the oldest disability trope in the book. And in this particular story, cancer is the focal point of every single piece of it. It is most of the plot and conflict. It is what raises the stakes. It makes up much of their characterization. It's how they meet other people. It's pretty much all they have in common with other people. It's kind of the only thing they talk about. I could go on. And to some degree, like, being sick does impact your entire life and become a piece of all of what you do, but a lot of the experience of being sick is also wanting to talk about literally anything other than being sick and avoiding it as much as possible, and trying to be firm in who you are and in how to engage in things outside of your illness. I also read an article by S.L. Huang with Disability and Kid Lit, where she said that she felt most alienated by how their entire social circle is people with cancer, because that is not something you can really base a relationship on, and most people with cancer want to stay as far away from thinking about it or talking about it as humanly possible. She also, regarding accuracy, said, "It picks and chooses which uncomfortable parts of cancer it wants, depending on which emotions it wants to peddle. It's horrifically dishonest. Cancer isn't like that. You don't get to isolate which awful bits you talk about and conveniently place them in a neat narrative arc." This story, as well as most other sick-lit stories, is very wallowy and centers itself almost exclusively around the pain and suffering of its characters rather than literally everything else about them, with a strong emphasis on the idea that living life with illness and disability isn't really life or living. Usually the main sick girl lead is stuck holed up in her illness and needs the male love interest to come in and to help her get outside of her comfort zone and be brave and do dangerous things so she can really experience the world before she dies. And it also frames disability as beautifully tragic, making this poor girl vulnerable and fragile and in need of saving by a strong man before it's too late, because obviously all feminine disability is just sitting at the window of our towers looking forlornly into the world below while polishing our glass menageries. It's so tragic, I need a man to save me. The Fault in Our Stars is particularly egregious with this because Hazel doesn't have a lot of character traits outside of her cancer until she starts to talk to Augustus about things, so it kind of looks like he's teaching her how to have an identity. And of course the Amsterdam section, centering around how he's being so manly and strong and hiding his pain from her because he must remain as strong as he can until he can't do it anymore. And to John Green's credit, Augustus does not remain strong until the end, but that's not the image that sticks with the reader based on how the book is written and also in how it was portrayed in the film. And it also romanticizes Hazel pushing herself too hard as being heroic or like sticking it to her illness. Like the fact that using the elevator at support group is seen as a last days thing to do, so she consistently uses the stairs despite not having lungs that work, and it causes more issues for her, or her pushing herself to do all of the stairs in this Anne Frank house despite it being way more than just stretching her capabilities a little. Also on the point of beauty, this critique does sometimes come up surrounding the book, but it's more commonly cited toward the movie. These characters still get to be conventionally attractive. They have hair, even through treatment, they're not incredibly thin or pale. All three characters we meet with cancer are white and high middle upper class, as is tradition with the general sick-lit genre. Cancer is not choosing white upper socioeconomic kids with strong family support structures, higher IQs, and access to both quality education and cutting-edge cancer treatments. The Fault in Our Stars is speaking to a cancer narrative different than that lived by most patients, a dramatic, romantic, and deeply philosophical one. But the biggest narrative issue of this book for me, which is one that is also just a general given within the genre, is that it tries to offer meaning from disability. It utilizes illness as a tool to teach us something about what it means to be a human being, about the meaning of life, about how great grateful we should be that we don't have to deal with this, whatever it is fundamentally an educational tool of sorts. And as Huang notes, I do not exist to be your tragedy. I do not exist for you to find special meaning in your life. I do not exist to teach people lessons or give people feels. She also mentions that the pediatric cancer survival rate is over 80%, so the fact that at least one child dies in every single one of these books is almost maddening. And there's also this expectation that young people have access to more profound opinions around life and death because of their proximity to it, which is very much a cliche that sort of leads to an expectation that young people facing death are able to cope with and process it like adults do, which is simply not the case. And also like prevents disabled kids from being able to be kids because we have this assumption that they've had to grow up too fast and that we expect them to meet us on a more adult level. And I don't want to touch too much on the hyper-intellectual profundity in this particular text because while that is a stereotype for near-death teens, it's also just how John Green writes characters more generally, so I'm not sure how much this particular voice in connection to this narrative in subsequent stories is pulled directly from this one or not, but in this specific context, divorcing it from how Green writes, it could be seen as an issue, and as almost like a super crypt narrative in and of itself because these characters are incredibly intelligent to sort of make up for something else. It's sort of hard to categorize what specific trope I would put the disabled children are more profound for their age than is typical into, but I do think it could be argued that it fits into the inspiration porn category because it's also along the lines of like the saintly, closer to God, Tiny Tim-esque style of looking at the world. It's also a common trope in the teen sick lit genre for the novels to show teens' acceptance of death, but not an acceptance of their illnesses, leaning hard into this cure or kill narrative because either the sick person dies or they get better. Hazel doesn't at the end of this one, which makes it a bit different and breaks that stereotype a little bit, but she also doesn't accept her illness either, and many people assume that she dies after Augustus does. Ultimately, that's up to the individual reader. John Green has never stated anything about what happens afterwards. But on the topic of death, the way that they treat their support group leader in this book, while he is incredibly annoying, don't get me wrong, is still very ableist and has this undertone of it would be better if you had died rather than gotten cured because you're insufferable. One article that I read talked about how the narrative of this book reinforces the medical model of disability, where all chronic illness is something to be solved via medical intervention, and I don't disagree with that in that much of the genre spends all of its time in hospitals or waiting rooms and is overly medically oriented, but also that's complicated because like I can say, yeah, I want to stop trying to cure my migraines and learn to live with them, and that's a very different thing from I have cancer that could be cured with chemo and I want to learn to accept and work with it. So that's a sort of yes and situation. There is an argument to be had about the romanticization of cancer and dying. I've seen compelling arguments on the matter in both directions because like on one level, it's not like these kids are doing absolutely nothing and waiting around to die or having a great time and ignoring it altogether. It shows that they're trying to live their lives with their illnesses. But on another level, the fact that their love story is doomed from the start and you know that is inherently romanticizing it. The narrative in not telling an authentic cancer story chooses what it wants to say to make the story smoother and prettier rather than realistic. It sort of relies on the premature death of one of the teens as an emotional gut punch at the end of the story, and I would argue that it kind of teeters back and forth between the two of them, but it does teeter more on the side of romanticization. But the thing I found most interesting in rereading this book was how often it would criticize specific stereotypes or make fun of them in a tongue-in-cheek way, only to either completely fulfill that stereotype later or get stuck in going so far to avoid it on one side that it fell into the alternate binary presentation of that stereotype on the other side instead. We talk about this concept in pretty much every single one of my media analysis videos at this point, but the thing about stereotypes, if you're not familiar with my work, is that they exist in binaries and thus going really hard against a stereotype will just catch you in a different one. A very obvious example would be like the Asians are math geniuses stereotype, right? If you try to avoid the math side of it, you could just end up falling into Asians are music geniuses, which is a different stereotype. If you avoid the girls are dumb blonde stereotype, you might end up in the girls are all bossy, controlling know-it-all stereotype. By avoiding the inspiration porn stereotype, John Green leaned into other harmful stereotypes of disabled people. In John's video posted after Esther passed away, he talks about how she wasn't an angel and how that is a dehumanizing way to look at people and speak about people. And you can see this mindset carry over into this book, but he leans very hard in that direction, which ends up causing issues in a lot of other directions. And I will cut this book a little bit of slack in that you can't avoid stereotype, you can only touch on it consciously and work on making the characters more three-dimensional than the stereotypes that they do have to have in order to be human people. So perhaps the poking fun at a stereotype while also fulfilling it was the method of choice in trying to manage both of those things here, but I don't think that was particularly successful. And the things that were most successful, like the jokes about being super crips, which is when somebody has a superpower to make up for their disability, those things ended up being cut from the film. So then it offset it even more when it became a film. One example is that there are several mentions of hating the warrior narrative about fighting cancer, but then near the end of the book, Hazel tells Augustus he's going to fight it and he's going to win. Or when they have conversations where they complain about people who become their disease, but then the central characters themselves are primarily just defined by their diseases, and that's kind of what we know about them and how they start their conversations every time they meet new people. And it does sort of resist the burden narrative in that she regularly thinks and acts like she is a burden, only to learn that she is lovable while she is dying, and that it is worth loving somebody who is dying, and the right people will love you no matter what. But the way that this lesson is wrapped up in this book is so much of an afterthought that I forgot about it until I reread it. The burden stuff is what I internalized. And it also does sort of resist the disability makes you asexual and unlovable stereotype, in that like Hazel and Augustus obviously have sex, but at the same time Augustus blames his prosthetic leg for being the reason he's a virgin before that, and Isaac is broken up with when he becomes more significantly disabled. So it's a bit tricky. But to wrap up the section and move on to the other things that I had to read and watch, my general thoughts on how this book handles stereotype were summed up by this sentence of Huang's review. The fact that it claims not to be a cancer book is all the more frustrating when it's pretty much the canceringest cancer book ever to cancer book. Overall, The Fault in Our Stars is what it is. I think if it were to be the only one of its kind, we would be looking at it a lot differently today. I'm not super mad at it. Obviously, I have notes, but it's more that the things that I would point out as smaller issues in this book became ubiquitous in every single story that followed, often made a lot larger and a lot more problematic in all the ones that followed, which made them more glaring in this one, much like we talked about with Curious Incident, but I would also argue that The Fault in Our Stars is a great deal more flawed than Curious Incident ever was. But let's move on to the next book and film to appear chronologically, which is Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jessie Andrews. It was published 2 months after The Fault in Our Stars was, in March of 2012, so there's no inspiration from Tafaios. I'm not saying the name of that book every single time in this video, so we're going with interchangeably with Tafaios at this point. But the Me and Earl film came out about 1.5 years after the Tafaios film did in October 2015, and there's definitely a lot of overlap in how the film was adapted from the original text, which is why I include it in the video regardless, even though it hasn't been even though the book wasn't inspired by The Fault in Our Stars. Now, this book tells the story of a 17-year-old named Greg who was just trying to play the social game of high school to be not popular, but also not unpopular, just to get by. His mother tells him that another student named Rachel was diagnosed with leukemia, and he's forced to be friends with her, and it's super awkward, but they eventually get in this like weird little friendship, and Greg also introduces Rachel to Earl, who's another classmate that he makes parody short films with, and Greg tries to pretend that he doesn't really care all that much about anything, but he puts his schoolwork almost completely aside to spend time with her and try to make her life a little bit less miserable, and then he and Earl start to make her a film. She ends up choosing to stop treatment because the chemo's not really working and it's making her beyond miserable, and they have a whole argument about it where she basically ends up telling him that he's a selfish prick, which is well deserved in my opinion. We'll get to that. And then there's a fight between Earl and Greg that leads to their friendship ending because, again, Greg is a selfish prick. And then on prom night, Greg is supposed to go with a pretty girl to prom, but he instead decides to go visit Rachel in the hospital. He gives her a corsage and then shows her the film that they made, which, for the record, isn't very good and seems entirely pointless. I really wish that the filmmakers had put more work and effort into this specific thing because it is the focal point of the entire movie, and then the film itself is just not good. But she cries at the film, it means a lot to her apparently, and then she falls into a coma and she dies later that day. At her Shiva, Greg and Earl sort things out and become friends again, and then Greg goes up to Rachel's room and he finds that she has created lots of little art pieces for him, like a sort of scavenger hunt, and she'd written to the college that he had been accepted to and then had that acceptance rescinded due to his failing grades to tell them what happened and ask that they give Greg a second chance. And then he sends the story and the film that he made to the college, and that is the end of our movie. And I liked how, right out the gate, the story centered itself on the idea that cancer just sucks and it doesn't teach you anything about life, nor is this story going to be inspirational or deeply metaphorical and profound. I also liked how there wasn't a grand love story or even a grand platonic love story, and how after she dies, it isn't a sort of hyper-tragic, oh, the world was deprived of this perfect person who could have been diatribe. It's just like, wow, this sucks and this doesn't feel good. They did a really great job of portraying other people's reactions to cancer, particularly childhood cancer, in literally forgetting how to be human people. And I really liked, I liked that she wasn't portrayed as some tough little soldier and she ends up making the choice to stop her treatment, which is, at least in the film, Greg gets incredibly angry at her about it in a way that felt age appropriate, but also kind of narratively an unfair thing to include. But a review that I read of the book said that it was handled more neutrally in the book, which they liked, and I do trust them on that. Now, it is at this point you might be thinking, City, didn't you read the book? You probably should have read the book. You're usually that thorough. But A, I was on a time crunch, so I only picked like 3 books to read. And B, I did start reading this book, but about 20 minutes into the audiobook, I was so infuriated by the blatant misogyny and racism and ableism of Greg as a narrator that I had to stop listening to it for my own sanity. I have heard the film isn't a fantastic adaptation of the source material in changing a lot of the vibes to be more in line with Tafaios, but I just could not get through it to tell you how much that is or isn't the case, and I didn't think it was particularly narratively worth it. They did improve Greg's misogyny a bit for the film, including taking out the random Nazi reference and the time he calls a group of people without friends cripples, but the undertones are still there, particularly with how much of, at the very least, a racial stereotype Earl is, if not just a full entire caricature. Now, I can't quite speak for the differences between Rachel's characterization from book to film, so this may have been different in the text, but I still felt like she was incredibly unidimensional and didn't really have a personality outside of being the sick girl who likes to do art. And the fact that she's not referred to by name in the title is already a bit of a red flag for me, because she is being initially categorized by the description of being the dying girl, which could be okay if they deliberately worked to break her out of that mold. Sick Kids in Love, which we'll talk about later in this video, like took that title and then worked with it in a way that I thought was interesting, and they did not do that here. It was always just a super Greg-centric, and you could argue that, like, of course it is. It's narrated by a teenage boy. It's going to be centered on him, but that puts Rachel in a really weird, almost tokenistic narrative position from the get-go. And she was still inspirational. I mean, Earl has this whole monologue about how he feels blessed to be able to see how patient Rachel is with her cancer, and we get this entire scene where she leaves a full scavenger hunt of sorts behind for Greg. So while it's great that she wasn't fully a narrative prosthesis, she didn't exist to teach Greg something large about what it means to be a human person, she still sort of kind of did that to some degree. That is what she was fundamentally there for. We watched Greg grow up over the course of being friends with this girl whose only character trait is that she's sick. And I felt, again, like the book was just saying, these stereotypes are bad, so I won't fulfill them here, and then it still fulfilled the stereotypes. They just look slightly differently from how those stereotypes are typically fulfilled, but that does not mean that they're not still stereotypes. I also just kind of felt like the story wasn't quite sure what its purpose was. It felt pretty aimless and directionless in its storytelling to me, but I also have always struggled to understand the interest and intrigue in slice of life stories that don't quite seem to go in any direction, so that might just be my own narrative bias creeping in a little bit. I just felt like the comedy of this movie was along the lines of like Napoleon Dynamite or like a Wes Anderson sort of thing, which is just not really my jam at all. I don't find that to be funny or even entertaining. But if we're gonna do a rating system, I would say narratively, I think this checks off less stereotypes than The Fault in Our Stars does, but this was a way less enjoyable experience, and also I think has a lot more covert harm with the misogyny, ableism, and racism throughout it than The Fault in Our Stars does. So I would say that Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl is worse narratively, so we're gonna put it below. We're gonna do a ranking system. This makes sense. This is gonna be great. Awesome. Next is Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon. This was published in September of 2015, a month before the Me and Earl film came out for timeline purposes, and then the film was released on May 19th, 2017. Also, did not read this book. I only read The Fault in Our Stars, Sick Kids in Love, and the first 20 minutes of Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, because everything else based on books seems to have been seen as a largely well-done adaptation of the source material, and again, saving time and emotional energy. Did you know? And this video is all over the place. Did you know that consuming this much media about being constantly sick, in pain, and miserable, and dying young and contemplating death does something to a person? Crazy how that happens. Anyway, Everything Everything. It's about an 18-year-old girl whose name is Maddie, played by Amanda Stenberg, who has severe combined immunodeficiency, which will be referred to as SCID going forwards, and she has been treated for it at home since she was 3 years old in what is functionally like a hypoallergenic, sealed-off bubble in the shape of her house. And she can't leave her house, or have anything, or meet anybody that hasn't been sanitized. So basically, she just knows her mother and her nurse, whose name is Carla, but she dreams of going outside and getting to see the ocean. After some new neighbors move in and they come over to deliver a present to them, she becomes interested in the boy who's about her age, and his name is Ollie, and they manage to give their phone numbers to each other and start talking, and they get really close really quickly. We also learn that Ollie's father is a very violent man. Maddie convinces Carla to let Ollie get sanitized so he can come in for a visit. She also then orchestrates another one by herself when both her mother and Carla are out, and then they kiss. Whoa. And then the next day we see Ollie get shoved by his dad in the like driveway of their house, and so Maddie runs out to help him because she's worried about him, which makes her mother realize what's been going on, and she replaces Carla with somebody who's a lot more strict and makes it harder for Maddie to do literally anything. So Maddie decides to buy plane tickets to Hawaii, lies to Ollie that she has been cured, and then they go off on a trip together and have a wonderfully magic romantic time, only for Maddie to collapse after becoming incredibly ill. Back home, she learns that Ollie and his family left the violent father and didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her, and she gets a call from the doctor in Hawaii saying that it doesn't seem like she ever actually had SCID, and that her illness in Hawaii was just her immune system freaking out because it's never experienced a germ before. And then there's a confrontation with her mother. We learn that she'd been lying to her entire life because she wanted to keep her safe after her father and brother died in a car crash when she was young, and Maddie escapes and later moves to New York, where she reconnects with Ollie, and presumably they live happily ever after. This is a really great movie to watch at 1.75 speed. I have never seen it any amount slower than that. Much preferred. Aesthetically, this film is gorgeous. I will give it major bonus points for that. Now, the first narrative thing to point out is how great it is to have a non-white leading character for once. That's the only time that is going to happen in this video, but I do think that narratively backfires in progressiveness a little bit, because then it's a white boy who's showing her the world, which makes the like male savior implications that are already there with these stories a lot worse, especially since this character doesn't even think about the idea of actually trying to do anything to get out of there or exploring the world until she meets this boy by seeing him through the doorbell camera and is immediately like, oh, how can I get out into this world? I like this boy who is the most generic, maybe I'm just gay, but he's really, anyway, it seems really weird that she's never really consistently thought about any of this stuff until that precise moment when a guy makes her decide to do that. And then of course, this film really hammers home the idea that it's better to live a short and full life than to live a long, sheltered and safe one, which like, yeah, it's good to like go outside and be a person and interact with people and not hide yourself away. Absolutely. Please step out of your comfort zone. That's great for you. But also, using disability as your explicit metaphor to tell that story is a bit of a dangerous choice because that directly encourages unsafe behavior. And also, disabled lives are worth living. There are ways to make more sheltered and safe lives just as fruitful and wonderful as anything else. It just takes a little bit of creativity. And again, disabled life is not just sitting at the window of our towers looking forlornly onto the world below while polishing our glass menageries. It's also not romantic to either literally or risk killing yourself for somebody you think you love that you don't even know that well because you're like 18 years old. Absolutely not. 0 out of 10. Do not pass go. Also, I take serious issue with this film's use of what is colloquially known as Munchausen's by proxy in its storytelling, with a mother actually pretending her daughter was sick when she wasn't. I have a history of the issues with the disorder that I will link above if you want to check it out. But as simply as possible, whether factitious disorder by proxy, which is what it's actually called, is or is not a disorder is still widely controversial because at the end of the day it is just medical abuse, and it is well documented that the existence of this disorder and the over-dramatized, consistent media portrayals of it has caused significant harm for sick people, particularly those in marginalized groups, to be believed and get proper diagnoses and medical care. So anytime it appears anywhere, I get incredibly frustrated. The fact that it appeared specifically in a story centering people of color bothered me even further. And I also think in this particular story, it puts it into the cure or kill narrative because in learning she's not actually sick, she gets to live at the end of the story. She gets to get the boy because her illness wasn't real. So it can have this uplifting and inspiring bittersweet ending. I will also note on the accuracy front, this is not at all how SCID works in how it presents or what treatment would look like. And the Immune Deficiency Foundation actually released a statement about how disappointed they were in this movie. This movie could have been a valuable opportunity to educate a wide audience about SCID, which is a rare genetically determined condition. However, the Immune Deficiency Foundation, IDF, is surprised and saddened that director Stella Meggy's, apologies if I pronounced that wrong, version continues Hollywood's trend of erroneously misrepresenting this condition through worn stereotypes and misinformation. The portrayal of SCID in Everything makes use of the same tire tropes that have been circulating Hollywood since The Boy in the Plastic Bubble was released in 1976, while adding new incorrect details about the disease. The movie's main character, Maddie, has lived her entire life inside her house, her own version of the plastic bubble, because, as she describes it, she is allergic to the world. The reality is that people with SCID are not forced to live their lives in a sterile environment, which is an antiquated notion that has not been the case for many years. In fact, it was never a standard treatment, having only been used in a handful of cases. Most persons with SCID who have received treatment lead healthy and productive lives with no need to shield themselves from the world. The portrayal of SCID as causing allergies is likewise inaccurate, as allergies are entirely different than infections, which is what SCID actually creates vulnerabilities to. In fact, allergies are unusual in infants with SCID because they are unable to make allergic antibodies. Perhaps most troubling is that the twisted ending of the movie informs us that Maddie never had SCID in the first place and was the victim of her mother's Munchausen syndrome by proxy. For anybody that has ever sought a SCID diagnosis, this will be particularly upsetting, as being accused of hypochondriac behavior is a common rebuff, and the film's reinforcement of this response is worrisome and dangerous. IDF understands that the concept of being forced to separate yourself from the world is an enticing tool for storytellers, but IDF would hope that entertainment is not an acceptable reason to do harm to an already vulnerable group by spreading false information about their condition. There is a wealth of easily accessible information about SCID, and in the future, we would ask that writers and filmmakers take the time to research the conditions they intend to portray instead of exploiting them through detrimental representations. Apologies for the long quote, but I could not have phrased any of that any better myself. The other narrative thing that jumped out to me immediately is, hey, why are all these chronically ill people so unbelievably rich? Where is this money coming from? Especially because she is in a single income household. Like, I don't know what's happening here or why none of these stories thus far have had a primary conflict be how can we afford medical care, because that is like an almost universal lived experience for chronically ill people. This is also not a plot point that appears a single time in this entire video, but that's all I have in this one. If we're gonna rank it narratively, I would say it's worse than the other two, but it's not the worst. The next two are the worst, so it's a little higher on the list. Next we have Midnight Sun. This one's going at the bottom of my list. This one came out in March of 2018. It's based on a 2006 Japanese film called A Song to the Sun, which would arguably make this story predate that of The Fault in Our Stars, but the English adaptation of it was clearly made to cash in on the sick lit film trend in the US at the time, so we're very much including it. And also they changed the plot significantly for the English adaptation to add the romantically killing herself and doing a deus ex machina for the main boy pieces to it, which are hallmarks of other things we've already talked about at this point. So, It follows a girl named Katie, who's played by Bella Thorne, who has a condition called xeroderma pigmentosum, or XP, which makes it dangerous for her to go out in the sun. During the day, she stays in her home with her single dad, and she also has a friend named Morgan, and sometimes in the evening she goes outside, but she doesn't really have anything to go out to very often, so it's super rare that she'll actually go out. And she has a crush on this guy named Charlie, who's played by Patrick Schwarzenegger, who she's walk to school under her window every single day for years, but never actually interacted with the guy. But one night he spots her while she is playing guitar and singing a song at a local train station where inexplicably they're using a Hogwarts Express style steam engine in the year 2018, and he talks to her and she panics and accidentally leaves her notebook behind. Oh no! He takes it. He returns it to her the next evening, hoping to find her in order to give it back, and then he promptly kisses her and they start a relationship. She doesn't tell him about her condition. She just says, oh, I'm only free on the evenings, and that's just how things roll. But then one night they go to a concert together, and then they go swimming, and then they hang out at a beach, and then she's like, oh no, it's about to be sunrise, I have to go, and she starts running like Cinderella style, and then he like throws her in his car, and then he gets her home, and he's super confused and panicking, and Morgan explains like, oh, she has this condition, and then she gets brought to the hospital, and apparently because she was exposed to sunlight for like 3 seconds, her brain is now contracting and it's gonna kill her, and don't worry about it. So depressed, she ignores Charlie's calls for a while until her father finally forces her to talk to him, and he's like, I still want to be with you regardless of your condition. And so they rekindle their relationship, and he brings her to a recording studio so she can professionally record some of her songs before she dies. And then she's like, I really want to go sailing with you, and he's like, are you sure? And she's like, yeah. And so she wears all white, and then they put her on the boat, and then they go sailing together into the sunset, and she dies. And then we learned that while she was alive, she made it. I can't even get through this plot without laughing. And then we learned that while she was alive, she made it so that Charlie will be able to get a full ride to college as a swimmer, so he can go to college now. And then we hear her song on the radio. I guess we'll start with the accuracy of it all, which no. So this film is gonna get like a singular bonus point for making me aware of a condition I didn't know existed beforehand. But it also has approximately less than 0 understanding of how that condition works, so I thus dock that bonus point. Because the film kind of makes her out to be like a vampire who dies the moment she's touched by the sun. In reality, XP just makes a person a great deal more prone to skin cancer, which is much more of like a long-term death situation, but I guess it's less dramatic. Also, just from a world-building perspective, how would she have been diagnosed with the condition if the first time she gets touched by the sun, she dies almost immediately, and there's nothing that can be done to like slow or stop the process once it's begun? I have a lot of questions. They also showed her lit by sunlight through windows in buildings on at least 2 occasions, which sure, like it's refracted through windows, so it might be okay, but she also has a custom window tint thing on the windows in her home to keep her safe, so I don't understand why it's okay in those settings. But then also, why has she been so lonely and isolated for the past 18 years if she can be inside buildings during the day? Or if she can't, people go outside at night. They do things at night. I mean, like in December and January, the sun sets around 4:30 p.m. It's not like she has to wait until like 10 p.m. to have human interaction. There is no world where beyond it being a story, it made sense for her to be that lonely and that isolated. And then suddenly after high school graduation, deciding she wants to see the outside for the first time, I understand that at this point, I'm not analyzing disability narratives anymore, which is why we're here for this video, but if the narrative itself doesn't hold up, that's a larger issue. I don't love that her being sick was used as a sort of plot reveal gotcha moment. I thought her going, well, I'm already dying anyway, which was never really formally confirmed either, like that was the case, which makes her choice all the more baffling. So let me just go out on my boyfriend's boat at sunrise and die in his arms and give him absolutely the most definitive lifelong trauma for no reason was just wild decision making on everybody's part, like in the film and then the people making the film. Also, much like in every other one of these stories, we don't really see this relationship develop between these characters. So as far as I'm concerned, you don't know this guy, and then you've decided to go and die in his arms deliberately. And then also, of course, the like, here's all the nice things she left behind for us to remember her by narrative thing reappeared here. This movie is just so half-baked as a film. It's really hard to critique anything else, but it does feel like all the other things we've analyzed thus far were put through a blender with Twilight mixed in and then produced this movie, which, if I haven't made clear enough yet, is at the bottom of the ranking list situation that we have going on. Just above this one, we have 5 Feet Apart by Rachel Lippincott with Mickey Daughtry and Tobias Iaconis. Again, apologies if I pronounce those names wrong. This book was released in November of 2018 and the film came out in March of 2019. This movie is about a teenager named Stella who has cystic fibrosis and meets a boy named Will, who's played by Cole Sprouse, who also has CF. And he has this specific lung bacteria that she could easily catch from him and it could potentially kill her, and so they need to keep their distance from each other. She's very like regiment oriented and organized, and he's more cynical and like just go with the flow, enjoy your life while you have one kind of person, which really bothers Stella. Also, she's a YouTuber, and so he starts to watch her videos and he falls for her from afar. And and they become close with her regularly FaceTiming him to make sure that he's doing his treatments. And then she has to have surgery because of a G-tube infection, and we learn that Stella is so anxious about things like that due to survivor's guilt after her sister died doing a daredevil stunt because her sister wanted to live life to the fullest because her sister couldn't. So she feels like somewhat responsible and like she has to stay alive as long as she can to make her parents feel better. That's loaded and not really handled properly. At this point, there's a lot of shenanigans that involve them sneaking around the hospital with a stick that measures exactly 5 feet to keep them at a safe distance. They also utilize that one M83 song from The Fault in Our Stars somewhere in here. But then the third friend, there's 3 different people with cystic fibrosis in this hospital that are all doing shenanigans together and interacting with each other in a way that's not super safe. And the third one dies, and so they're both like, oh, we need to reclaim what cystic fibrosis has taken from us. And so then they escape the hospital to go ice skating on a frozen pond. And then while skating, she learns she's going to get a lung transplant that will save / at least largely extend her life. But she decides to ignore that and just enjoy her time outside, which is wild decision making. And then she falls through the ice, shocking, I know, and he has to break the 5 feet rule to pull her out of the water and give her mouth to mouth to save her life. Mouth to mouth has not been a standard part of CPR since 2008, but sure, I guess this is romantic. But he only has so much air in his lungs because the cystic fibrosis, so he gets really woozy and he lays down next to her. And then they're brought back to the hospital. We learn that she didn't get the bacteria from him somehow, and she's still able to get the lung transplant. And during her surgery, Will learns that his drug trial isn't working, and so they set up lights outside of her room, and he makes some drawings for her. And then right when she wakes up from her lung transplant surgery, he says his final goodbye and then confesses his love before leaving the hospital. And this was the first movie that made me start to wonder why I've never seen any of these chronically ill children have therapists, because that's usually like one of the early things the medical team will recommend to help with coping, and also is a thing that would probably prevent a lot of the large amount of reckless behavior that keeps coming up over and over. I cannot believe this girl turned down a pair of lungs so she could enjoy ice skating with the boy that she likes. There's also this interesting catch-22 of sorts where 2 disabled kids falling for each other comes across a bit as like, the only one who will love you is your own kind, which is more firmly asserted in this film than in others. But then the alternative being a non-disabled person helping a disabled person learn how to enjoy life is an issue in its own way, so there really is no way to win there. The story, of course, again has the guy telling the rigid and anxious girl that she needs to loosen up and enjoy life while she still has one, and thus encourages reckless behavior. Also him doing a giant romantic gesture for her right after she wakes up from surgery, which is a time when you feel really bad if you didn't know that, is rather rude of him in my opinion. The visual of him trying to save her by giving her mouth to mouth and then losing breath himself and laying down next to her is very Romeo and Juliet in a way that felt glorifying and icky. The film had a lot of her looking longingly at couples kissing and being cute, as well as sitting and pondering death pensively. The 2 of them stripping to show each other their scars is kind of cool. I'll give them that. On the accuracy front, cystic fibrosis is incredibly varied from person to person. Also, treatment for CF is changing very rapidly, so I know that some people have connected to this material while others have been infuriated by it. At the very least, it does portray them as being incredibly fragile and spending their entire lives hospitalized and being always left out of things, none of which are typically the case. And the way that these kids are all on the same wing of one hospital and are all also able to roam freely is absolutely inaccurate. I do sort of like the idea of like, hey, hospitals don't always suck all the time that came across from that. I feel like hospitals tend to be super villainized in media, and having a slightly different narrative was interesting to see. But this story also felt a bit in the Blender realm as well, and the narrative it was trying to tell was so inaccurate to something that would actually happen, but tried to pretend it was very realistic in a way that was a little bit maddening. And it glorifies what is functionally self-harm, so it goes below everything on our little list. And then our final film is Then Came You, which came out in February of 2019, and I really enjoyed it. I would definitely return to this film in the future, and I do recommend it. It is about a teenager named Sky, who's played by Maisie Williams in a very interesting wig, who has terminal cancer and has made a to-die bucket list of everything she wants to do before the end of her life, and she meets this hypochondriac named Calvin, played by Asa Butterfield, who is convinced that he's going to die imminently at a support group, and they become friends. Sky decides they're friends, and Calvin just sort of reluctantly goes with it because he's like, all right, I guess so. I don't have anything better to do. But they slowly check things off of this list, many of which result in them like getting pulled over or called out by the police, who then are like, oh, you're the kids who are dying. We'll help you commit crimes. It's totally fine, which I think is my favorite part of this entire film. Sky dies at the end, as is expected, but it didn't feel like it was trying to force the audience's hand to sob about it. It was just a realistic, matter-of-fact, sad thing that happened. I found this movie to be really upbeat and weird and silly in a tasteful way, because at the end of the day, we just get to see this kid live her life and be a kid while she can, but not in a way that ignores the ugly side of cancer either, nor in a way that makes it feel like the whole story is about what Calvin can learn about life from this dying girl. It's evenly about their friendship and how they support each other during this time, and how she gets the boy out of his shell instead of vice versa. There's also no like grand romance really, which I really liked. The end particularly stood out to me as what makes this story different because of how Calvin starts to have a panic attack and feels like he can't do what his friend needs to do and be there for her in this moment. And the speech that he was given wasn't a sort of like inspirational, you need to stay strong for her, or anything that felt like pandery to the audience. It was just simply, this isn't about you, okay? And what you think you can or can't do. This is about her, and she needs you in her corner right now. So he just pulls himself together and he just does it because he needs to. There was also space after she died for there to be some sort of like gift she left behind with the sad, sappy voiceover, as is traditional in all of these movies. I kind of was expecting it, but instead we just saw him silently read and absorb a card that she wrote to him while seeing a montage of their time together. It didn't feel like it was trying to emotionally manipulate you into feeling things. It just felt like we're watching this young person have a private moment of getting to say a last goodbye to his friend, which was all the more moving because we didn't get to see it. It was just for him and for them. And that's something that I didn't realize the rest of these were missing until I saw this as a different narrative option. I don't have much else to say here. I think the stereotypes it did feel like obviously having the sick girl die at the end were warranted because of how they handled the rest of the story. So yeah. Go check this one out. Highly recommend. Going second to our list. The last one is going to be number 1 on my list. And that, of course, is Sick Kids in Love by Hannah Moskowitz. It was published on November 5th, 2019. It's written by a disabled person, and oh my gosh, can you tell? Breath of fresh air. I do still never want to read a YA romance again, but this one was a fun time at least. It follows a girl named Isabel who has rheumatoid arthritis, and her father is a workaholic doctor who generally chooses to ignore the existence of her illness as much as he can. She writes for an advice column in her school newspaper and generally has like a no dating rule because she just doesn't really want to deal with it, which is fair. Dating in high school is not a good time. I support her decision. But then she meets this guy named Sasha at the hospital who has Gaucher disease, and they become friends and eventually they fall for each other, but not in like a magical star-crossed lover kind of way, more in the awkward way that first relationships go, with the added complexity of both of them having unruly bodies that sometimes require changes in or canceling of plans, and trying to manage limited energy with all of the things that they want to be able to do. I purposely made that summary pretty vague because I do want you to read this book, but first, it gets a million bonus points for not having somebody die at the end. I mean, at the end, something medical does happen to Sasha, and that's incredibly stressful for everybody involved, but there's full expectation that he's going to be fine. It's just gonna suck for a little bit. And I also loved that it didn't do like the gender role thing at all, beyond having a narrator be a sick girl. In fact, if anything, it's the boy that's telling the girl to be more safe in accommodating her disability. They evenly took care of each other over the course of the story in a way that was honestly really gentle and intimate and beautiful, because that's what mutual care looks like, and I kind of loved that. Going off script for a hot second, but I think something that all of these books try to do is like, oh, it's so romantic that he has to care for her and they have to care for each other and that kind of stuff, and all of that just felt like contrived, and this book, it just felt like, yeah, this is what it looks like. And there is something so beautiful about knowing when your partner's exhausted, or knowing what their specific care needs are and that kind of stuff, and encouraging them to support themselves. And this was just done so beautifully and so realistically, and I really loved it. And it also perfectly encapsulated the trickiness of balancing being a teenager with being a sick person, the struggles of being flaky, of having friends forget you need accommodations in the first place, of having various parent responses to illness that are positive and negative. And we spend a lot of time in her inner thoughts that instead of being around accepting death or longing to be like everybody else, like every other internal monologue that we've seen thus far, it was about her insecurities around being sick enough or looking sick enough, or whether she's allowed to use accommodations, or what other people might think of her for using those accommodations because she's invisibly ill most of the time, and all of those various anxiety spirals that come with fighting your own internalized ableism that comes with being a disabled person, especially one who has significant experience with medical gaslighting like she does. It also talks through her thought patterns of, this takes this many steps and then half a flight of stairs and then I have to go this many blocks and then I will be in a building that is heated, which will help with my joints and make them relax a little bit, and all of that extra work that it takes to just be a human person that I really enjoyed. This is a book that, had I read it as a young person, would have completely changed how I viewed myself and processed my own needs and struggles, and it's just getting a huge gold star of approval from me. But that brings us to the end of this Man With Analysis. Thanks for sticking with me. In conclusion, I think what we learned today is that having characters be human people outside of their disabilities is really helpful in making a compelling story and also making your story age well. Intersectionality is really cool. Supporting disabled authors is really cool. Accommodating yourself and listening to what your body is trying to tell you is really cool. pushing yourself beyond your limits and or actively killing yourself is neither beautiful nor heroic. And most importantly, sick women and femme-presenting people do not need saving, nor do they need a man or partner regardless of gender to teach them how to really live their life to the fullest, because half the time that's just pushing them to do unsafe things and not respecting their own needs or boundaries in a way that is super dangerous and not at all romantic and or cute and actually just abuse. Also, don't make out with people in Anne Frank's house. That's really weird. I feel like that one's pretty self-explanatory at this point. I think that about sums it all up. To put them all in order from best to worst, Sick Kids in Love is first, absolutely. Then Came You. The Fault in Our Stars squarely in third place, solid. Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl in fourth. Everything in fifth. 5 Feet Apart in sixth. Midnight Sun is so far at the bottom that it's not even on the list. If I missed any of your favorite Sick Lit movies or big life lessons that we learned in this video, let me know in the comments. I'm also on a quest for any disabled romance books that aren't deeply heterosexual. I will say that Sasha's bisexual in Sick Kids in Love, but still, I would like to see a sapphic or a gay disabled romance. So if you have any, please give me recommendations. I am actively seeking them. I love getting to read romance books with the excuse of, oh, it's just for disability reviews, so please give me more. And let me know your favorite sick lit movie or book. No judgment as to whether it's good or just a guilty pleasure. You're super allowed as long as you think critically about it. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. I sure went on a trip and learned things along the way, so that's gonna have to be enough. I need to go read something else that's nonfiction to wash the inside of my brain out. But with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.